Hi, so I'm going to record to you our read aloud from Palace Wagon Family. This chapter is called The Adventure Ends, and I probably am needing some glasses to do this. All right, here we go. When Mr. Reed was rested enough to talk about it, he told how he had found Patty and Tommy at the Breen cabin, where the resourceful Breens still had a little sugar, a few seeds, and some roots a passing Indian had thrown to them. They tasted a little like sweet potatoes, only they had strings in them, Patty remembered. She and Tommy had not been welcomed by the Breens, she said. They wouldn't have taken us in if it hadn't been for the meat and flour that the men gave us. After it was gone, they had to shoot Towser, their dog. Virginia knew how desperate they must have been to shoot their dog. What then? She asked a little fearfully. Her father had already told her how he had found Patty sitting on top of the Breen cabin with her feet in the snow. He had asked after Tommy, and she had said, "He's inside sleeping." Virginia knew too well what her father must have thought. He had found Tommy alive, but at first the poor starved little boy had not recognized him. He kept calling Patty Mama and asking if it was really Pa. The seed cakes his father had brought finally convinced him. Patty was given a whole apronful to pass around among the Breen children. I like that part the best, she told Virginia. The cakes had been a little late for her birthday. It had been a terrifying day with wolves howling outside the other cabins, and the people too weak to try and get a shot at them. To make matters worse still, Patty had been suffering with a toothache. Then Mrs. Murphy had come in raving about having nothing to eat, and the things she had said were so frightening that Patty could hardly repeat them. Pa came in time, she finished. He wrote all about our trip back in a little book he kept in his pocket. Virginia felt glad that there was another little book to tell the story. Keeping it was Mr. Reed's way of making his adventures known, even if he did not live to tell his family about them. And there were times during the snowstorm when he felt that he and the people with him would all be lost. With the snow, there was a perfect hurricane, he had written. In the night, there is a great crying among the children, and even with the parents, there is praying, crying, and lamentation on account of the cold and the dread of death from hunger and the howling storm. The men up nearly all night making fires. Some of the men began praying. Several of them became blind. I could not see the light of the fire blazing before me, nor tell when it was burning. The light of heaven is, as it were, shut out from us. The snow blows so thick and fast that we cannot see 20 feet looking against the wind. I dread the coming night. Oh, Pa, I keep spilling tears on it, Virginia exclaimed when she had read this much of the diary. You'll have to tell me the rest. The storm did get worse, didn't it? I can tell from the condition of your poor feet. Much worse, he said. I hope I shall never witness anything like it again. Of all the praying and crying I ever heard, nothing ever equaled it. Mrs. Breen kept telling the men that it was murder to lead the people out into such a storm. Once she called, "Raid, raid." Patty's heart had stopped beating, but it wasn't true. Mac said he only wished it was her tongue that had stopped. Our fire was nearly out, but he got it going again. You should have heard the children, Margaret, he continued, turning to his wife, who was listening with tear dimmed eyes. They were like little snowbirds chirping around the fire. One would say, "Thank God for the fire." Another would exclaim, "How good it feels," or "I'm glad we've got some fire." It was hard to keep them away from it. Mary did get too close during the night and burned her foot. She and Nancy were with me. We were all warming ourselves, and the fire did feel good, Patty put in. They wanted to come too, but we had to leave them when the Breens wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? Asked Virginia. They just gave up, I guess. Eddie and Foster are on their way in with a third relief party. They'll rescue their own little boys if they're not too late. I don't see how they can do much for the Breens. Mrs. Breen always manages some way, Patty said hopefully. I did send some of my men back after them, Mr. Reed continued. They may bring in the Donner children too. John Stark went along. He's bigger than Bill McCutcheon and says he can carry 2 or 3 of the starving children on his back. Hiram Miller went back to carry more children after carrying Tommy in. Patty was determined to walk it first. She was afraid I wasn't strong enough to carry her. But my sight had come back, and before long I was marching along with Patty riding piggyback. Remember? I do remember the stars and the angels, the little girl replied in a dreamy voice, and how I almost went to heaven. I was there for just a little while, but then I thought of my secret and I had to come back. She's telling the truth, her father put in when Virginia smiled at what she thought was one of Patty's pretend plays. She did cry out something about stars and angels. Mac and I both thought she was dying. I had a few crumbs in the thumb of my mitten and they helped to revive her. It wasn't until we saw her talking to that little wooden doll of hers that we knew that she had really come back to us. We had reached the camp in Bear Valley. Almost the first thing Patty did after she had been fed and made comfortable by the fire was to take out that little doll. I had to tell her how happy I was. I always tell her things, Patty said gravely. A little later, after helping her mother put the boys to bed in another room, Virginia returned to sit by her father. She still had a great many questions to ask him. In his diary, he had written that the people were crying and praying as if the two were just the same, but to her they weren't. When she prayed, it gave her courage. She tried to explain it. Something happens to me inside, I feel stronger. That's the way it should be, declared Mr. Reed. I left the Breens praying for a miracle, and yet they wouldn't make the effort to save themselves. Their prayers helped me. I liked them best when Mr. Breen read from the prayer book, and I held the pine torch for him to see. I made a vow to become a Catholic if we were all saved, and I intend to keep it. You don't mind, do you, Pa? Virginia saw at once that her father did mind. His face became stern. We aren't Catholic, he began. Religion ought to unite families, not divide them. It won't divide us, Pa. I thought a lot about it back home when I used to visit the Catholic Church with my friends. You didn't object to it then. That was different, he said. Here, the Jesuit priests have been in power too long and their government has become corrupt. I saw what goes on at the mission in San Jose. They convert the Indians only to draft them into slave labor in their orchards and vineyards. Surely you don't approve of that. It will change, won't it? I mean, now that California is an American territory. Let's hope it becomes a free state soon. This whole question of freedom is one you ought to be thinking about. You may not like being told what to believe. As for your promise to God, Mr. Reed finished, you were afraid you would starve to death when you made it, weren't you? I'm sure the Almighty wouldn't expect you to keep a vow that you made in fear. Maybe not, Virginia admitted, but I would expect myself to keep it. That's a level 6 comment, isn't it? He's saying God's not going to expect you to hold true to your vow that you made because you were under duress, you were starving. And she said, maybe God won't, but I will, right? Very level 6. Maybe not, Virginia admitted, but I would expect myself to keep it. I made a vow too, Patty announced suddenly from the bed. I promised my Dolly I'd save her and my other treasures and show them to my children and grandchildren. So you see, I had to live. I wasn't ready to be an angel. Virginia didn't tell her that she already was one, but she thought it many times after that. People just naturally loved Patty. The Sinclairs adored her. Mr. Reed said that Patty's faith had encouraged them all when they were carrying her out of the snow. Britt Greenwood, the old trapper's son, had been almost as helpless and as poor as starved Solomon Hook, but Patty had said, God hasn't brought us this far to let us perish. Boys, if there is an angel on earth, Big Mac had said, Patty is that angel. Just listen to the child. Mr. McCutcheon, in spite of his rough ways, had proved to be a real friend. Little by little, the Reed children heard about it from their father. After his banishment, he had reached California and started back to them from Sutter's Fort with horses, mules, and provisions, which Captain Sutter had generously supplied. Mac had joined him, and they had traveled together as far as the head of Bear Valley when a snowstorm caught them. It was the same Halloween snowstorm that caught us, wasn't it, Papa? Asked Patty. I was on one of Mr. Stanton's mules, riding behind an Indian. He said it was, and there was a little silence. It would always be that way whenever they spoke of those who had perished in the snow. Mr. Reed still hoped a third relief party on its way would save a few of the people he had left with the Breens when their courage had deserted them. None of us would be alive, Virginia thought, if Pa had given up like that. Looking back over his diary, she could see how he had not once given way to despair, even when the commander of the Navy had refused to grant aid so that he could return for his family. He had noted his sympathy was that of a man and a gentleman. And when he had finally been given authority to raise men and horses, and they were on their way without Mr. Woodworth, who had failed to meet them, and first the river and then the snow stopped them, forcing them to unpack their horses. He had written, usually the men had kept in the best of spirits, but here for a few moments there was silence. When the packs were ready to be strung upon their backs, however, the hilarity and good feeling again commenced. So we will stop right there. We just have a little bit more to go till we and maybe kind of find out a little bit about what happened to them. One of the interesting things is that Patty Reed grew up and got married, and she ended up living in Capitola. So she kind of lived just right down the road from us. A lot of these people that were part of the Donner Party didn't really want to talk about it because it was such a traumatic, horrendous experience for them. And so, a lot of them just kind of settled in and just kind of lived quietly, and didn't really want to ever talk about what they had experienced or what had happened to them again. All right. Thanks for joining me.